Good morning, everybody. We're going to get started. Buenos dias, and welcome to the Inter-American Dialogue. Thank you all very, very much for coming. Tomorrow at 5 p.m., Puerto Rico's Ricardo Rosselló of the New Progressive Party will no longer be the island's governor. Rosselló came under enormous pressure after highly offensive, outrageous, and tasteless chat messages between him and close aides were leaked on July 13th, touching off massive street protests across the island demanding his resignation. As is the case throughout many Latin American countries these days with anti-corruption movements, journalists played a key role, as these messages were published by Puerto Rico's Center for Investigative Journalism. At first, Rosselló resisted, but it became increasingly clear that what has been dubbed as WikiLeaks was the last straw, and his situation was unsustainable. Rosselló has now named Pedro Pierluisi as Secretary of State, who, if confirmed, would then probably step in as Rosselló's successor. For many Puerto Ricans, the chat messages exposed the corruption and cronyism of the island's government that, together with long-standing grievances about a bad economy, 12 years of recession, and the government's poor response to Hurricane María 2 years ago, provoked an unprecedented organic social explosion and movement. Many observers have described the current moment as a powerful awakening that offers the opportunity for meaningful reforms and positive change. But seizing such an opportunity will not be easy and will not be quick and faces enormous obstacles. These are, after all, uncharted waters. This morning, we are very fortunate to have with us three experts to help us understand what is happening in Puerto Rico, what it all means, and how to move forward. First, we have Jose Mercado, who is the Washington correspondent for El Nuevo Dia, Puerto Rico's newspaper of record. He's covered Washington and federal affairs for the publication since 2001. We welcome him. He was going to have to leave us a little bit early because he has to cover a hearing at the Senate that's very relevant to Puerto Rico, and so we're glad he's with us, but he's going to have to leave us a little bit early. But thank you, Jose. Gretchen Sierra Zorita is a public policy and communications consultant. Gretchen deserves credit for bringing enormous attention in D.C. to issues affecting Puerto Ricans on the island and the mainland. She actively participates in a number of very important initiatives, including the National Hispanic Leadership Agenda Puerto Rico Working Group. Thank you, Gretchen, for being here. And Pedro Reina Perez is an award-winning historian and journalist specializing in contemporary Spanish Caribbean history. He's full professor of humanities and arts and cultural agency at the Universidad de Puerto Rico and is now the Wilbur Marvin Visiting Scholar at Harvard University. He's had a distinguished academic career, received his doctorate from the Centro de Estudios Avanzados de Puerto Rico y el Caribe. And Pedro just came in this morning from Boston, from Harvard, so we thank him very, very much for being here. It's great to have you with us. Before starting the session, let me recognize the extraordinary efforts of Ricardo Barrios, who is my colleague at the Dialogue, for pushing and prodding us to organize this event and for tremendous coordination of all of the details and administration. So thank you, Ricardo, for making this happen. Let me say, I also see a lot of people in the audience who have a lot of expertise and a lot to share about the situation in Puerto Rico, so we look forward to your comments and your thoughts. So let's start, if we can, with Jose, and if you could just tell us, share your perspective about, these protests that we've seen. Where did they come from? Sort of came out of nowhere. How do you interpret what's the factors that are behind these protests, and what is different if anything, about these protests than other kind of movements and protests that we've seen before?
We have never seen this before. Ricardo Rosselló accomplished what no other politician in Puerto Rico has. Eliminate partisan colors for a few weeks and unite and outrage people in a quest for justice. Most of the demonstration, I will say, happens spontaneously, including the first biggest one of July 17, when hundreds of thousands gathered near the Or San Juan. Artists such as Bad Bunny, aka Benito Martinez, Residente, René Perez, and Ricky Martin, now Ricky the Good One, as he's known now, were active participants. But really, no one knows exactly who called for that first big protest. That protest for me was very important because it was, without a doubt, a confirmation that the country had lost all confidence in its governor. For me, in that one, was a call from the people saying that, asking Rosselló to resign. The biggest concentration that was 5 days later, in July 22nd, that one was called from, the one that called for that meeting was Residente. So that one we know who started the call for the activity. This time, John Residente, Bad Bunny, and Ricky Martin were, we can say, the official leaders, with many other artists joining the call to action. Around 600,000 people answered that call. It took 15 days for Rosselló to resign, but I will highlight the activism of these urban music artists, especially I will mention Bad Bunny, because as it seemed to me, he can attract many young people who have not been enthusiastic about joining politics or politics debates. And my question now is, and I know everybody, we were talking before the start of the event that who knows what can happen, in 2 hours. But will these artists become the keepers of our political class? Looking ahead to 2020, if I were a politician, I will be very worried.
Great, thank you. And what do you think, how do you assess the prospects of just, it's hard to predict.
Well, today we have the confirmation hearing for the nominee, for
Right.
Pedro Pierluisi, the former President Commissioner of Puerto Rico for 80 years and former candidate for governorship. He lost in June 5th of 2016 against Rosselló. We don't know if we have the votes. There are a lot of members of the Senate and the legislature supporting the President of the Senate, Thomas Rivera Chats, to be the next Secretary of State and then the next governor. He has not said, I'm a candidate, but with all his supporters mentioning him or giving him public support, it's obvious that he wants the job. He is already the leader of the NPP because the other vice presidents of the party, Jennifer Gonzalez and Carlos Johnny Mendez, that is the Speaker of the House, allow him to take the leadership in the NPP. So, we are counting votes. The New Progressive Party, that is the one that supports statehood for Puerto Rico. So everybody's counting the votes. I don't see only, I believe that only if Rivera Chat says to his caucus in the Senate, it's okay, confirm Pierluisi, I don't see how he's going to be confirmed in the Senate. Apparently, the Popular Democratic Party, the main opposition party, is not going to support him, or at least there are not going to be consensus in favor of Pierluisi. So, with the Populares divided, with the NPP divided, I cannot guess. I don't know if he's going to have the support of the Senate. Maybe he can get the support in the House. I'm very doubtful at this moment that he has the votes in the Senate.
But let me just follow up if I could. I mean, what are the streets? I mean, one thing is the votes, the other thing is the streets and the pressure. What would they like to see happen? What are the people who are protesting? What now? I mean, we're in a situation where tomorrow at 5 o'clock he's out. There's no governor. Looking for a replacement. Do they expect him to pick somebody who's completely
I think
not in his party?
I think they want a change, but because these protests, I believe, and I'm in Washington, so no, maybe Pedro was in San Juan some of these days, but I believe that we can agree that they want change now. They want clean politics. They want to get out of the cronyism to the cheap partisanship. But I cannot say that I can represent exactly what all those different people were trying to say or how to move forward after this moment. It's not clear. In the past, we can say the opposition leaders were calling for this. The unions were asking for this and this. Now it's clear that they are tired of corruption. They are tired of partisanship. I will make a comment. People have to remember in 2016, 17% of the votes went to independent candidates. In 2012, if I'm not wrong, around 4% only was for parties that were not the Popular Democratic Party or the New Progressive Party, that are the ones that had been governing Puerto Rico locally for the last 60 years. So I think you mentioned the economic situation, the austerity measures. I will also remember that one of the choruses that we heard during the protest was Ricky renuncia y llévate a la Junta. Ricky resign and take the board with you. So, maybe the board has to be worried also about this moment. People are tired of austerity, but at the same time, people understand that we are in a fiscal crisis, that there is a big debt. People are asking for an audit of the debt. It's interesting that in the draft that we published this week of Chairman Raul Grijalva, that is the chairman of the Natural Resources Committee and the person in charge of Puerto Rican affairs in the U.S. House, he included that proposal as one of the alternatives to amend PROMESA. He also is claiming for the possibility of discharging part of the unsecured debt. That's a proposal that Elizabeth Warren and Nydia Velázquez and others have been submitted in the Congress during the last 2 or 3 years. So, I don't know. I cannot tell you exactly what can happen. I don't think that they want more of the same. And we may see that, tomorrow at 5 p.m., because there's no doubt that there are going to be demonstration at 5 p.m. tomorrow close to the Fortaleza. That can be, a celebratory moment, or it can be, more protest and more discomfort with the process.
Great. Thank you very much. Very helpful. Gretchen, let's turn to you, if we could, and let's pick up where Jose just left off. How do you study sort of public policy issues related to Puerto Rico? I mean, how does one take advantage of this? People thinking about, what are the next steps? Obviously, this revealed enormous corruption, discontent, the economy, response to Hurricane Maria. But, how do you see this movement, this energy, really translating into public policy changes, reforms in Puerto Rico?
Well, there's two aspects of it. One, is this on?
Yeah, just turn it up. Yeah.
Okay. There's two aspects. Más cerca. Okay. Gracias. There's two aspects of this. One is the learning process of people in Puerto Rico as agents of change. Puerto Rico has been a colony for over 500 years, and people have had experience with rebellions, and they have not gone very well. There is, when you have been a colony this long, there is an acceptance of your fate because you really don't have a clear way out. So while Puerto Ricans, have traditionally voted on the on election day, and they have high voter turnout, this whole notion of the individual being an agent of political or social change is not as ingrained as in the United States. Let me give you an example. When I see something in the news, and I don't do this every day, so don't get the wrong impression, that I don't like, I will either call my congressman or send him an email. And if it really annoys me, I might even ask for a meeting. Again, I don't do this, I'm not that kind of person, but I have done it, okay? That notion of being an active citizen is not something that's been part of their experience. Try to find your legislature, and the website for the Puerto Rican legislature is actually pretty hard. It's not easy. So going back to what I'm trying to say here is that I think, and I hope that this experience of that, yes, I can be an agent of change. Yes, I can ask for change and actually get it. There was results, because one thing is to ask and to push and get nowhere, but they actually had results is, not only as an awakening and a learning process, that they see that this is something that they can do and should be cultivated. And I hope that the organizing groups that are on the ground take advantage of this moment to turn it into a learning moment of what a citizen can accomplish and what is the proper conduct of an active citizen. So I think that is one thing to be learned from. The other thing that worries me an awful lot is this coalition. This is a highly organic coalition. And I thought what Jose had to say about Residente and the urban artists was really interesting, because a lot of the people that were there don't listen to Bad Bunny or Residente. I like Residente, but I'm not really into Bad Bunny, but people love him, So what I'm trying to say is that, yes, people love Ricky Martin. These people, pulled together people who don't even like the type of music they produce. But somebody wrote an article, it wasn't me, about the role of the arts in these demonstrations and how they united Puerto Ricans, because Puerto Ricans they're very funny. They're beyond funny. They're very creative, and this is the way they express themselves, and they unite it. And so people would see these expressions of creativity and art and recognize themselves in this. And to give you, the ways they protested were beyond funny. They had protests that, was a protest. Then they had this man who I love, Ray Charlie, who is this man who would go with 3,000 motorbikes, and he would spend the evening through the housing projects in Puerto Rico, getting everybody, behind the cars and riling everybody up, and all over San Juan, and people would take pictures, and you could see the highway was like this line of light coming through. And then at the end of it, when the demonstrators in Old San Juan were flagging, Ray Charlie would show up, and everybody became like a huge fan of Ray Charlie. Another day they brought horses. They brought like 300 horses. Another day they jet skied and brought boats in from Fortaleza, which faces the ocean. I saw yesterday that Susan Soltero, who is our weather reporter, had a protest where she was rolling down a hill, because she had a mishap a while ago where she fell and rolled down the hill. So everybody was rolling down the hill. These are expressions. And then of course there's music and dancing, all sorts of things. What? And oh my God, and the banging. So these things bring together people in a very, very organic way. Now here's where I was going with this thought before I got distracted. Puerto Ricans are not experienced at building coalitions. And it's not because we're necessarily Puerto Ricans, because I think a lot of people in this world, including in Washington, D.C., are not experienced at building coalitions because they don't understand a coalition. A coalition is something where there is one issue that people agree on and feel extremely strongly about. Not kind of strong or not, it's, but like really strong. And the issue here is corruption. And as long as that is the focus, I think they will be able to keep the coalition and keep the pressure. The problem is people start inserting extraneous issues, such as la Junta, for instance, the issue of la Junta, Ricky renuncia y vete a la Junta. The Junta is a very valid thing, but the track to solve the Junta is on a lane that goes to Congress, and the track to stop corruption is on the lane that goes to the government of Puerto Rico. So, if you try to put those two together, you're really dividing the energy and the thought process. The same things with status issues or political parties and so forth. So, and the moment you start inserting all these other issues, you start losing people. Because not everybody is in agreement. There are some people who actually like La Junta. There are people who hate La Junta, the status. And so that's one thing. You have to keep the focus to keep the energy. And the other thing is you have to, this sounds silly, you have to lead and move with a generous heart. You have to try to embrace everyone and everything and not act out of spite. And as an example, there's a change.org resolution going around to change the name of the convention center, which is named after the father of Ricardo Rosselló, Don Pedro Rosselló, to something else. Take the name off because of this. These are people who are part of the movement. Acts of this sort does not accomplish anything but to alienate people. So, to kind of wrap it up, I am very concerned that, that this movement could lose its focus and then be splinter and lose its energy. And I'm also concerned about the back to school, because if this had happened during the school year, it would not have been the same. And so we have to think about things like back to school and university students going back and so forth as we move forward.
Thank you very much, Christian. That was terrific. Pedro, if we could step back a little bit, you're a historian. You have that perspective, bring that perspective to recent events. Is this different from what we've seen before in Puerto Rico? If so, how? Is this a new kind of politics? Is this really an inflection point, a break, or do you see it as sort of an episode, a moment and then we'll sort of resort to sort of business as usual in Puerto Rico?
I think this is a momentous occasion. If you look at it from a historical point of view, there is no precedent for Puerto Ricans taking to the streets for so many days and for the crowd to keep growing day after day and protesting in very creative ways. One thing that strikes me about this moment is how horizontal it was. Just like Gretchen said, it was very organic. And I think what fueled it, the thing that drew most people to change their behavior and go into the streets, is a sense of trauma. There were many things kept under a lid that have been developing over the past 3-4 years. Think of the bankruptcy, for example, and all the austerity it has brought. Think of the hurricane. The fact that people felt abandoned. Corruption was not a big driver. People were still disgusted with what was going on. Think of La Junta as another trauma. Having 7 people appointed with full immunity and having no recourse to challenge them. So people kept, swallowing and swallowing. And I guess what tipped everything over was finding out, the famous chat that the governor and his close advisors were mocking people. That was something that, deeply hurt the dignity of the people. And for the first time, people were willing to take a step forward and say, no, you're mocking us, Ricardo Rosselló, we're going to shame you in very creative ways. And in that moment, what I would call, in looking for a comparison, partisan politics in Puerto Rico are a blood sport. Puerto Rico has only had an elected governor and a legislature since 1948, to put it in perspective. And through most of that period, both main parties, the statehood party, the New Progressive Party, and the Popular Democratic Party, basically shared power. They acted like a cartel. They had common interests when, they approached the administration of the colony. They, paid close attention to certain things, and there came a point when they were undistinguishable. And that created sort of a system of levees, just like New Orleans and many cities to contain the waters. They were protests in the past, of course. University students bear historically the weight of being responsible for very violent protests. When this started, it was common for people to say, it's the same people, la misma gente, los pelú de la universidad. That was wrong. Of course, unions have protested in the past. And of course, there have been civil, manifestations. In 2003, we had a huge march to get the Navy out of Vieques. The Navy spent 60 years bombing and polluting the island municipality. But that protest lasted one day and was convened by the then governor, Sila Calderon, and religious leaders. It was, more. But she presided the march. I remember her walking down the street. It was 2000? Oh, but in any case, it was the convocation came from authority, different from this, and it only lasted one day. But it's a series. It's a series of events that led to the Navy's leaving Vieques. But I'm using it as a reference. I'm not saying it's the same thing. But what, in my opinion, happened was that the more angry people became and the more frustrated with what was going on the island, in that moment, the levees broke. When you saw artists like Residente or Calle 13 calling on people to manifest themselves, that sort of announced the arrival of a different moment. People say that millennials are not into politics. I would say millennials are not into partisan politics. They're very political. And this was the chance to say, okay, I have to get myself out on the street. In my opinion, one cannot understand this, and I will refer back to what Gretchen was saying. I think the fact that the manifestations and the protests took so many days can only be understood as the floor moved, because people, for example, need to understand that for 120 years, we've been a U.S. colony. We need to talk about U.S. imperialism to understand what's behind this. We cannot hide behind the fact, we're second-class citizens. We need to ask ourselves, why are we second-class citizens? Did we ask for U.S. citizenship? No. We got it, and we got a second-class citizenship because it was tailored to the needs of the U.S. Congress. All the violence that has come from that, the asymmetry of power, basically helps to begin explaining the feelings that we're seeing represented in the population and in public. On top of that, why do we use culture as a way of expressing ourselves? Consider that Puerto Ricans who oppose the United States have been jailed and have been repressed for many years. So people took it, and they internalized after 1957 when the gag law, we had a gag law from 47 to 57. When this law was passed, the independentistas, who were at some point the second political force in the island, were pushed back to the third and kept right there. And people internalized, wow, if I use the flag, if I speak Spanish, if I express differences with the government, I can lose my job, I can lose my house. So all of this happened, and as a result, we have not been able to express our national pride like any other nation would. And in that moment, artists became, representatives of us. That is why Puerto Ricans, professional athletes or Olympic athletes, have also been a representation of national pride, and people felt comfortable expressing their feelings in sort of a safe environment because, you're not a stateholder or an independentista. We're rallying around, our national team. So when this moment came, it was natural for people to use culture as a vehicle because we feel comfortable. And that is when the artists come in and you begin seeing that not only have they convening power, but people respond in their very own creative ways. Lastly, I think, like I said in the beginning, what drives this is anger. El partido del coraje. We are angry. How does that translate into the next phase? It's hard to see. It is obvious that people want instant gratification. It's only natural. We're human. They protested and got the governor to resign. But that's as much as we can get at this point. My theory, the one I would like to offer, is that the next stage is not so much who's going to be governor. This is a Game of Thrones. If you read the paper right now, there's like so many possible scenarios. But in my estimation, the next focus of anger is going to be the legislature. Because in the end, the legislature has been a corrupt body for the longest time. And people are angry. One of the persons vying for the governorship is Tomás Rivera Schatz, who's the president of the Senate. And he's not well liked, to say the least, because he's very confrontational, misogynistic, homophobic. He's un cacique partidista, in the Latin American sense. He's smart, fast, in your face, whatever. And why the legislature? Because it was only, people like La Junta, something Gretchen was saying. People like La Junta. Why? Because they thought they were going to come clean the house. But we have learned that since 2016, they haven't been, that willing to do anything that may disturb the status quo. But people actually wanted La Junta to come and basically, take extreme measures against politicians. Now we know they won't do it. Why? Because La Junta also has interests. However, recently, La Junta started putting controls on the legislation and demanding that the legislature's budget be revealed. And that is the ultimate thing, because the legislature is where past politicians, relatives, and friends find jobs. So surrendering control of the legislature's budget is like the ultimate step. So at this point, I expect people to turn their anger towards the legislature, because right now, after the governor's resignation, what we have seen is everyone vying for position, but vying for partisan positions, not for a citizen's position. If that were the case, they would have chosen a completely different interim governor, someone who had credibility, moral capital, a name. Right now, it's, the governing party has recently learned that they're going to have an uphill battle to get reelected, and they want someone they can trust to put the hands on the levers of power. That's how I see it.
Who was there with moral capital and there's some
Yes. The mayor of Bayamón, Ramón Luis Rivera, is a stateholder, and people expected him to be that one figure that people could coalesce around. Senator Larry Seilhammer, another stateholder, but they were never approached. This is just a game of, who can I trust? And obviously, the president of the Senate knows that he has veto power, basically. And whomever sits there, he's going to be someone that can respond to his interests.
Great. Thank you. Gretchen, let me go back to you. I mean, you're here in Washington. How has Washington and the different parts of Washington, political parts, sort of responded to the events of the last 3 weeks? What do you anticipate is going to be the reaction? Is there a sense that this is a real opportunity now and to do something? Or, what is your sense with Congress, with the administration, with different parts of the sort of the Washington scene?
I guess which Washington, is it on? There we go. I think this whole thing started 15 days ago. People were giving space for events to develop, and I still think to some extent they still are. It was very unnerving that President Trump did not tweet for a long, long time when this was going on, which led to suppositions of something's going on and we don't know about it because he's so quiet, and that's so unlike him. There were also on the opposite side, on the Democratic side, people were also reticent to say anything and just let things develop, not wanting to jump into the fray and think and show themselves as people who intervene in the affairs of others. And then Congressman Grijalva, bless his soul, jumped the gun, and somebody interviewed him, and he kind of spoke off the cuff. It was just an automatic response. I don't think it, and he said, I think he should resign. And people were appalled because, this is viewed as interference in internal affairs. Well, soon after that, events took over, and then it became obvious, and then other people joined that call, some before, some later. And because it became apparent, it was not about this person being against the political party of this person or being against this person per se, but the fact that this person had lost complete credibility. And that he was no longer able to govern, and that stability was needed, and that we needed to move on. I think the second issue that is very intense is the federal funds. How are we going to get those funds right there? So you have a sense of the funding. This disaster was estimated at $91 billion. I think it's the third or fourth most expensive disaster in the history of the U.S. Of that, the federal government has allocated around $42 billion for Puerto Rico. And of that, around 14 or so billion has been dispersed, meaning it's out the door. That's like about a third of the money that's out there. Before this scandal happened, we know that Puerto Rico is not a priority for President Trump. That was very clear. The response to Puerto Rico, both in terms of disaster and in terms of the federal role, was delayed in a way that was not delayed for other states. On top of that, you had his suspicions that there was corrupt activity going on in the island and so forth. And I think we need to be frank with ourselves. President Trump would have these tweets where he would say, we have given them $91 billion and they're all corrupt. And everybody on Twitter would go, you're wrong, you lie, it's not $91 billion. But nobody would say anything about the corruption, where it's like crickets or cookie as we go. So now we have strength in his hand, basically, because now he has, cause and reason to say, well, I was right. So that is a problem. And so before the scandal, the money was definitely being held up here. And it still is. But now it's going to be more difficult. So, I don't know if you want me to go ahead and talk about this, but, interrupt me, please, if I'm too long.
Please.
But this is why people are, going around with ideas of federal intervention of this or that sort. Federal intervention has already happened. The funding, the FEMA funding that was being approved at Core 3, which is this entity in Puerto Rico, is now, because of this, being approved back in Washington. We have sindicatos, federal officials in the Department of Education, where was, the head of the Department of Education, the former head was one of the people that was indicted. We have also in housing, which handles the HDBDR grants. Those are the big block housing grants that are used for reconstruction. CDBGDR. It's like the name of a band, the CDBGDR. Okay. Anyway, those are handled through housing. And then they're thinking of putting also federal officials in transportation, I heard. So we already have changes. And the question is, going forward, what else? You know, people are very afraid of La Junta acquiring more power. I want to say this again, and I'll say it again, and I'll say it again. There's section number F. La Junta has power to, you know, to require accountability and transparency and good management of funds, and it never exercised it. So the blame is partly on them. And to say that they need more power when they had the power and did not use it is illogical, you know, to me. So let's be clear on that. So they're talking of other elements, includes the monitor, federal monitor, to oversee these programs. People jumped at the idea. But then Grijalva's Promesa bill also has, well, the draft also, as Jose mentioned earlier, has a reference to some type of coordinator. So, you know, there's clearly out there, there's people outside in Puerto Rico that are looking for that. So the idea has been planted there. Now, I want to say two things about that. Maybe three, but two. One is people hear federal monitor, whatever, and they see more intervention, more power, okay? There is a role for the federal government, and the role is as follows. The federal government has the expertise, the capacity, the know-how. They have been dealing with the federal acquisition regulations for eons to transfer this knowledge to Puerto Rico. And so I think they do, they can play a very good and supportive role. The same way that the U.S. government goes to the third world and does capacity building in the third world, which includes things like this, we can do something similar. So there is definitely a role for the federal government. The concern, though, that many people have, including myself, is if you have an external actor to come and fix things, as soon as that external actor leaves, you're going to be back to where you started. Is this, you know, the overused phrase of if you give the man a fish, you feed him for the day. If you give him the fishing stick, you feed him for a lifetime. People in Puerto Rico need to know and learn and, you know, internalize these things. Some of the things that came out in these chats and so forth, it's stuff that I used to be a former federal government official. My body does not permit me to do the things they were talking about, you know, because I've been trained here, not there, okay? So I'm not exactly sure. A lot of people talk about umbrella oversight organizations that include people from, you know, the civic sector, the business sector, unions, you name it. Check and balances to perceive what's going on. But it has to happen, whatever happens, it has to be Puerto Rican led and Puerto Rican born, because otherwise we're not going to learn how to see it. And one last thing I'd like to say, and then I'll stop, is the business community. The business community has a role and a responsibility of this. Part of the anger that is coming out of this is because the social divide in Puerto Rico has grown massively in the last 13 years as a result of the recession, the junta cuts, and the Maria. And there is, you know, we're among the top 10, we were a country, places with highest income inequality, the gap between incomes between the lowest and the highest, which has nothing to do with poverty, by the way. That is real. And a lot of the anger comes from that, this growing, you know, we used to have a very robust middle class. We always pride ourselves as like, we're not like Latin America, we have a middle class. We're not like Mexico where you have very rich people and really poor people, we have a middle class. That middle class has been squeezed and out, okay? It affects the tax base, it affects the consumer base, but going back to the business class, which is at the top of the pile, they have been reticent to join in politics, partly because sometimes they're the beneficiaries of decisions made by the government or contracts or whatever. You know, one of the people that was arrested was the president of BDO, big consultants in Puerto Rico, because they were filing. And sometimes it's because of benefits, sometimes it's just they don't want to be part of it. But it's not gonna affect their bottom line right now. Nothing has happened in terms of the economy. This is too short and so forth. But going down the road, it could affect their bottom line. And more than that, they do have a social responsibility. To those who much is given, much is expected of. And so they have the clout, they have the know-how, they have the economic muscle, they fund campaigns. They can go and say this has got to stop. And I think we need to put it on the business community to take an active role. Several of them have done, just to, the head of the Republican Party in Puerto Rico, Soraya Fonalleda, who's also the owner of Plaza Las Americas and Enterprise. Oriental Bank has spoken. One of the manufacturers, Passive, which is an industrialist, has spoken. So people have spoken. We need more people like this and to put it in the face of the government.
Great. Thank you very much. Before we open it up, let me ask Pedro one more question, and then we'll get your question. So you should start thinking about what you want to say. Pedro, what should we be, in terms of where this goes, and obviously there's enormous uncertainty and it's hard to predict, but I mean, what are the things that you'll be looking for? And what should we all be following to get a sense of where this is headed over the next?
If this is going to transcend protesting, we're going to have some leadership. Again, we are going to have to begin seeing faces that are credible, that are not partisan, and that can articulate a vision. That is not happening at this point because the artists we referred to before basically convened some of the protests, but they're there and their job is not to assume leadership. So if this is going to move beyond, we're going to begin seeing perhaps some division, but we would need a way to articulate a vision because institutions, the government in Puerto Rico is like in any other state here. We have elections every 4 years. We don't have, mechanisms to recall public officials. It is not like we can bring down the government. Institutions are there to preserve an order and the rule of law. We need to follow the rule of law, like it or not, because it's the only, roadmap we have. We're going to see some pretty dramatic, I think, things happening as actors jockey for position come tomorrow at 5 o'clock. But beyond that, if the ball gets kicked to the Supreme Court, which is something, there is a un litigio in the horizon. If Pierluisi, is rejected by the legislature or whatever, it's pretty clear that the whole matter is going to be sent to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court in Puerto Rico has become as polarized as here. So whatever they do is going to be interpreted as, an expression of partisan politics, and uncertainty remains in the air. That uncertainty, unfortunately, has been with us since before, because, we expected the junta, we didn't know what was going to happen. The junta came into power. It's been 3 years. Their performance has been so-so. They have been very timid. But the junta, for example, tried to have a federal official at the Treasury. But the court, the judge that is presiding Puerto Rico's courts, thought it was not a good idea. So someone to control the government's finances was not put into place. The Washington Post, for example, has called for greater control of Puerto Rican affairs, which is something people fear, because the more you federalize the government, the more power you take away from citizens. And remember, the illusion for Puerto Rico for half a century was that we could govern ourselves, that we had control over our affairs. That's what basically led the Popular Democratic Party, what allowed them to paint the picture of Puerto Rico, being sort of sovereign. That, however, came to a stop with all these developments and a decision from the U.S. Supreme Court, People versus Sanchez Valle, who basically clarified Puerto Rico's colonial condition, vis-a-vis the United States. And the U.S. Supreme Court has also shown more willingness to take on Puerto Rico cases, because Sonia Sotomayor is a knowledgeable legal scholar, and she's not afraid about digging into complex matters. So we're going to see the courts expressing themselves more. One final comment. Harvard's Law Journal published a special number about a year ago calling for something called territorial federalization or something like that, because the author basically proposed the idea that given the impasse in Congress, the fact that they could not get anything done, that perhaps the courts could move the ball forward. And Juan Torruella, who is the only Puerto Rican judge at the appellate level, basically said enough of colonial experiments. You know, this needs to be clarified by the legislature and by the people and not by the courts. So the plot thickens.
Great. Thank you very much. These are great comments. Let's open it up. Please tell us who you are, be brief, and please wait for the microphone so we can get this. We passed around. We'll start with Ramon Dabon. You're in the first. Don't start talking until you have the microphone.
Thank you, Michael. Ramon Dabon, I'm an independent consultant in democracy and economic development. First, Michael, you started by saying this is uncharted territory. Puerto Rico has always had its life charted, but by someone else. And it goes back to 1492, 93. So the problem is that there is nobody to do the charting right now. There's nobody now to do the charting right now. Washington is busy with other things. So they're waiting for somebody to chart, and they're trying to invent a chart of where to go, but they've never done it before. The last time Puerto Rico ran its own destiny, the governor was a Taino named Agüeybaná. That was the last autonomous government of Puerto Rico. So what is the problem is powerlessness. And we're talking about the symptoms which have to be addressed. The patient is ill and needs attention, but the fundamental disease is powerlessness. And this is what Pedro well mentioned. It reached a point where the people have realized that they are powerless. And Washington doesn't know what to do with it. So, Gretchen, you talked about our habit here of addressing this, using the structures to address our displeasure with what's happening in the Congress. We call our congressmen. Puerto Ricans don't trust the structures because they're not their structures. So they don't use the structures. When they come here, actually they learn pretty soon to use the structures because the structures are dependable and they vote. I mean, they don't vote as much, but they use the structures. Puerto Ricans they're not their structures. They never created those structures and they're not theirs.
Ramon, we're going to have to pass to other people because I think they got the gist.
I'm addressing this point to Pedro particularly, but to Gretchen at the end, and they show the structures.
Okay, thank you. Right behind you, please.
Hi, thank you. Helen Santiago Fink. I'm a climate urbanist, and I spent 5 months in Puerto Rico as a resiliency planner working for FEMA. My question is, do you see any potential for los municipios to play a stronger role? Because they are very frustrated, and I recall working with a number of municipalities saying that we're not even going to apply for some of the disaster funds coming in because we're not the right color. So clearly the partisanship is there. So this may be a wake-up call, a new opportunity. Do you see any potential for greater decentralization of power outside of San Juan and having the municipalities play a stronger role in terms of directing the future of Puerto Rico? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. This gentleman here in the front. We're gonna come back to you. There's one more question. No, just three. Okay, is that okay? And
Thank
then we'll
you.
come back. We'll do another round.
This question's for Gretchen, but anybody can
Tell us
comment.
who you are, please.
Oh, yes. Hi, Federico de Jesus, former administration official both here in Puerto Rico and consultant. I wanted to address this question to Gretchen because she's the media expert, but anybody can answer. Part of the corruption issue in Puerto Rico was in the private sector, especially in the media, and the chats revealed the pay-to-play with reporters that were being fed questions and play-to-play schemes. So I think corruption in Puerto Rico has been institutionalized, but if you can talk about how the media and the government and corporations also are involved in the scheme, I think that would explain the society-wide indignation beyond the Maria deaths.
Great, thank you. Let's go back to Gretchen and Pedro, and then we'll take another round of questions and comments. Microphone, please.
I think I'm going to hit the municipalities first. The municipalities issue is confusing because my understanding is that they used to, they have experience in how handling these type of grants, CDBG, DDR, grants, whatever. But what we're now talking about is a program of humongous amounts of funding. So, whatever capability they had, this is like saying, okay, you can do one push-up, but now you have to do 100, So there is that issue. Insofar as the partisanship, that drives me nuts. That the mayor from municipality would be denied money on account, federal money, it's not even local money, on account of partisanship is just crazy. But it's going to get very complicated because this whole secession that's going on right now, part of the people who support Tommy Rivera Chats are the mayors of the island. Well, the ones from his party, not necessarily the other ones. So the mayors are part of this secession Game of Thrones that's going on in the legislature. And so, they are, if they succeed in bringing Rivera Chats, which we really don't know right now, will Tommy open the gates for the mayors? I don't know. I think there's a role for the mayors. They definitely have to be part of the process, but I don't think they have the capability to handle that kind of funding with some type of structure. I think there has to be some type of supportive structure for them to handle. And yes, definitely be on decision making from beginning to end. They're the ones who know what's going on down there, but I don't think they can do it on themselves. On the media. Before Trump, we could say, that does not happen in the United States, But after Trump, it's so crazy. Well, we could, if it happened, we could pretend it, okay? But with Trump, after Trump, is like, the media is equally crazy here. You have to go through reams of stuff or avoid certain places if you want to get down to the truth. But yes, the chats did reveal that, that there was influence of the media. And I think people have taken that in stride. I think they're more shocked by other things that have happened. I can tell you something that has happened to me that's very strange and interesting, and I laugh with joy that this has happened that has to do with the media. One of the people that, broke the story that was significant was el Centro de Periodismo Investigativo, which is the equivalent of ProPublica. It is nonprofit. It does not, it does not, look up, doesn't depend on anybody, but the public who funds it and grants, okay? And they were instrumental. They're a little operation. They only have 10 editors and reporters. And La Junta, by the way, has, I think, 18 people in Puerto Rico and staff, than all the consultants, by comparison. And they broke this major story, okay? So I had this idea, when Rosselló resigned, it was clear he was going to resign matters when the next day I'm going to start a fundraiser, a Facebook fundraiser, okay? So I put like a $500 limit and then 2,000 and then the thing started just going in the same way as the protests, organic. It is now at somewhere, last time I looked at reaching 28,000. And I plan to close it down when we have somebody, okay? I don't know who that somebody is going to be. That tells you a lot. I mean, at some point it was funny, it was because you're friends, and then it just kind of went out there, and everybody's friends trying to friend me now. It's like, I don't know you. I can't friend you, but I've gotten from $5 to $500, in donations. And so what that tells you is that people in Puerto Rico has a deep appreciation for the press. This has been like in a week, okay? I mean, it's crazy. It's so funny in a good way. Have a deep appreciation for the press. They have a deep appreciation for the free press, and they have appreciation for the people that gave them the information to do it. Because in Puerto Rico, we don't have great oversight independent organizations. And the ones that do it have enormous trouble getting information. I mean, half of the time, Centro de Periodismo Investigativo is suing people to get information, as in other organizations like Espacios Abiertos, and so forth. And so these organizations are really, the press is extremely important. People recognize it. And that little fundraiser is the proof.
Pedro, you want to ask anything?
Okay, yes. On the municipality question, Puerto Rico has 78 municipalities, and that's complex because you have very rich municipalities around, the metropolitan areas and very poor municipalities. Mayors, however, hold an important lever of power because you cannot get elected if the mayors don't do the outreach to people. So they, as a bloc, are very important. But the conditions being imposed by the junta are threatening smaller municipalities with a small tax base. So some of them are really struggling for survival to provide basic services. And in this scenario, I don't think there is much. I mean, they are not in a position to offer the accountability that many of these funds will demand. Maybe they can, come together and create a coalition or something. But I see municipalities in general as being very frail moving forward. They have been dependent on the government for general expenses, but now they're being asked to, carry more of the weight by La Junta, and some of them simply can't. It's like, we'll lock the door and walk out and see what happens. On the media, it's also interesting and complex because the media market has shrunk. The economy in Puerto Rico, has been in a depression for over a decade. And as a result, we have more partisan media because they're depending on the government for advertising money. The chat revealed, a complex picture because the participants in the chat were incredibly conscious of their public image and very willing to use any means possible to silence critics and to use troll farms as a way to silence that criticism. I have to say that journalist Sandra Rodriguez Cotto had denounced this in her blog before, and she kept saying, there are a lot of, Twitter's account holders out there who are being paid by the government, fotutos, we call them. And in the end, it proved to be right. I think the Center for Investigative Journalism has, basically raised the standard. This is their historical moment. They've been around for a long time, but as Gretchen said, they've been suing right and left to get information. And this is the one outlet right now that people trust. Full disclosure, I've been a columnist for El Nuevo Dia for 16 years. And the paper has been, indicted in public discussions because it's been mentioned in social media, and it's been questioned about, how their business practices. They're a media company, but also a real estate company, so it's, it's a complex operation. So a lot of scrutiny is on the main media outlets right now, and it's still in flux. We're still trying to see, what else we learn, because allegedly there are more chats to be revealed. We haven't spoken about federal arrests, which is part of the combustive mixture we've been talking about. We're expecting more arrests having to do with corruption. But one final comment on this. I dispute the notion that, the problem is that Puerto Rico's political class is corrupt. You don't have a colony, to be fair. Over the past 120 years, a lot of people have profited from Puerto Rico being a colony. I mean, just follow the money. Congress has, all of a sudden assumed this very, moral authority tone and saying, oh, yes, no, Puerto Rico, you're bankrupt, you're going to have to pay it yourself. So we're paying for La Junta from our money. But follow the money and go see how many committee chairmen have raised money in Puerto Rico over the past 40, 50 years. Everyone was profiting from Puerto Rico. Corporations were profiting, banks were profiting from Puerto Rico, and all of a sudden, it is only our fault? I dispute that.
Great. Let's take another round of questions. Yes, we'll start with you, and then
Thank you.
tell us who you are.
I'm sorry. My name is Howard Hills. I am in the Executive Office of the President and in the National Security Council. I was the lead counsel negotiating the treaties of free association with Palau, the Marshall Islands, and the Federated States of Micronesia, and recently written a book called Citizens Without a State regarding Puerto Rico's self-determination process. But I just want to say, I think this last couple of points that the panelists made were the most important. And earlier you said that the business community had to take leadership role in addressing corruption and whatnot. And I think that that's the most important thing I heard said today, along with the comments about that the the 936 companies were on the take too. But at any rate, the point is, when the business community in Puerto Rico decides that it's good business to end corruption, they can participate in the structures that we're used to here in order to address the corruption issues. And they are the ones that have the economic power and the political power to end it quickly. So I really wanted to agree with your remarks. One thing I didn't agree with was it wasn't a matter of disagreeing, but you said they weren't treated the same as the other states. Well, that's because Puerto Rico is not a state that it wasn't treated the way Texas and Florida was. And the point I wanted to make and conclude with is this. I think if you look at it historically with the 32 territories that have become states and the 4 U.S. governed territories that have become nations, generally speaking, it's crisis that leads to the political status solution. In Alaska, if they had not become a state in 59 and that earthquake from 64 had hit Alaska before it became a state, it would have been treated just like Puerto Rico was with Maria. And the point is, you look at Kansas, you look at Mississippi, Alabama, forget Idaho, Utah. It always was a crisis that led to Congress realizing, we need to either make this a state or we need to make it a nation. In the Philippines, it was the Japanese occupation during World War II. So I want to end by saying I agree with what Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez said. She said, the departure of Rosselló is the beginning of the decolonization process for Puerto Rico. And I think it's going to lead to either statehood or nationhood. And the one thing I would think is an important historic note is that in 1952, when the people went to the polls, and I believe they do have a high sense of political efficacy in Puerto Rico, they voted overwhelmingly for a constitution that said U.S. citizenship was of paramount importance to their identity as a people. So I just wanted to share those comments.
Thank you very much. Very helpful. You back there, and then Peter. I'm sorry. Just wait for you. Just wait for the microphone, please.
Hello, everybody. My name is Adi Martinez. I'm Senior Policy Analyst for Oxfam. Hello. Thank you for the panel. Great dialogue. We have been mentioning how local politics right now is like a God story. And that is not to be taken lightly. I think it points out to constitutional deficiencies. I mean, of course, there is the major constitution deficiency of being part of a colonial setting, but I'm talking about more local mechanisms for participation. So what are your thoughts about what comes now? What should be done now after all this power struggle gets settled? Hopefully, crossing our fingers in the best way possible. What will come out of this? There should be constitutional amendments in Puerto Rico, like, let's say, integrate or change the figure of Secretary of State, like a vice governor that is elected by the people, or maybe referendum, a revocatory referendum mechanism that could be used to avoid having to have, massive protests in order to be able to express ourselves when we don't like a public servant, etc. What are your thoughts on that?
Thank you very much. Peter, do you have a question? Then we're just going to get 2 more, and then we'll come back to you.
Peter Hakem, the Inter-American Dialogue. I must say that this is one of the first public discussions that I participated in about Puerto Rico, where the status of the island, state, independence, continued as it is, that hasn't been a central theme. That didn't evolve. Now, our previous question to your question did begin to raise it. And I just, rather than saying what should happen, do you see that the events over the past couple of months changing the politics in some kinds of profound ways? Is this really a disruption, a big change for Puerto Rico that's going to lead to more, or not saying yes or no, but what is the prospect of seeing a really major shift in politics in Puerto Rico? What the issues are?
Thank you.
We're going
to come back to these 2, and then those are the last 2 questions, and then we'll come back to Gretchen and Pedro. Sorry. We just have two more questions. It's okay. I hope you're taking note, Pedro.
Jack Martin.
Okay.
My question basically ties into a couple of other questions that have been put to the panel, and that has to do with the fact that when you have an outpouring like this, it basically says that the people don't have any confidence in the judicial system as the solution to the problem. Is that a correct assumption? This is from the point of view of an estadounidense, that we would expect if we had this type of a problem with regard to corruption in a state in the United States, that it would be dealt with by the judicial system and people wouldn't have to turn out in massive protests. And that also ties into this question, does this type of an outpouring of public antipathy to the ruling system indicate that there is going to be concern in the future with regard to the issue of statehood, both from the point of view of the U.S. and from the point of view of Puerto Rico?
Thank you. Sir, right next to you. Thank you.
Hi, my name is John Carlos. I'm a concerned citizen from Puerto Rico and now living in D.C. I wanted to follow up on what your question was, and mainly it was about like what could be done regarding the Constitution itself. I mean, the Constitution does place certain aspects of how it can be changed, how certain changes can be made. But what are the possibilities of actually assembling, like a constitutional assembly as Asamblea Constituyente, as it happened between the 1950 and 1952?
Thank you. Pedro, you want to start or?
I didn't get the last part of your question. What is it?
Constituyente.
You want my opinion on constituyente?
Yeah, basically on how we see. I remember back in 2012, Ángel Israel Rivera wrote in 80 Grados wrote about how the Constitution itself was basically made for bipartisanship, and how that it sets a precedent throughout the years for bipartisanship to basically, be the norm over the next few decades. So with so much antagonism in Puerto Rico against like más de lo mismo, how do you see that playing out, and any changes to the Constitution itself, or maybe like an overhaul itself?
I think it's a long way at this point because, again, we need our legislature had a chance to take a stand for what people were asking for, someone that can lead us through this moment, or simply choose someone who is going to do business as usual. And they have taken a stand. Had they wanted, to strike a different tone, they would have chosen a different person than Pedro Pierluisi. I'm not questioning his integrity, but his appointment as Secretary of State basically speaks about control of power rather than conceding to the public's demand of transparency. I don't see changes to the Constitution happening anytime soon because the legislature is acting as business as usual, and as it is not in their interest right now to strengthen or to create mechanisms for the public to recall elected officials or anything like that. On the question of status, I think it's one thing that struck me. These past 10 years have led many Puerto Ricans to leave the island, particularly young people who have come stateside and professionals, and that has, that started before the hurricane. I suspect, I haven't seen any data, but I remember that in 2016, in the spring during the primaries, Pedro Pierluisi ran against Ricardo Rosselló, and the New Progressive Party expected turnout to be around 600,000 people, but it only came out to about 400,000. That difference, those 200,000 people, speak about the fact that perhaps, and this is, a speculation, many people that advocated statehood basically realized that, it's not coming anytime soon, so I might as well. You have the opportunity, I'll move stateside. We need to see more statistics on electoral participation, but the hurricane led a lot of stateholders to actually realize that no one was coming to help them. And that was an assumption that stakeholders had before. The U.S. government is there for us. They're going to come help us. I have heard, a very active political family say, they're killing us. That realization of, abandonment and despair in general has, I guess, awaken some sort of political conscience. I don't know. But I do know that some people are less afraid of facing decolonization, which is not the same thing as self-determination, because we need to approach this from a colonial perspective. And mechanisms to resolve this cannot only be measured by participation. A constitutional assembly, in my opinion, is out of the question because each main party would be terrified of losing. So when you move the question of Puerto Rico's political condition, the two main political parties always oppose any process that they cannot control. So, for example, every referendum that we've had over, the last 20 years has not offered a conclusive result, and the two main parties try to retain control and make sure that if they're going to lose, then they boycott the whole process to deny it any legitimacy. So a lot of things have to happen before I think we can effectively address the political status. But in my estimation, things have changed. And that change is going to be expressed. I just don't know when and how. And for something radical or substantive to happen, we need leadership. And right now, I'm not seeing it.
Thank you. Gretchen, a number of questions you might want to address.
Yes, okay. I'd like to start with something that Pedro said that I'm going to clarify because I'm not sure everybody in the audience understands what he means by what he said. If the legislature was really listening to what just happened in the last 15 days, they would have come up with a candidate that clearly was somebody everybody could support and was clearly somebody who was either very clean or willing to take a stand on corruption. Okay? That has not happened. What has happened is Ricardo Rosselló has appointed Pedro Pierluisi, who has a lot of sterling qualities, by the way, but he is the representative of the establishment sector of the pro-statehood party. He is the establishment. And on the other side is who they want to nominate is Tommy Rivera Chats, who represents the mayors, the municipalities, the people from the country, and the fundamentalist religious sector. Hence, a lot of the points of views that are not considered progressive. So the reason they're battling this out is not because Tommy is more honest than Pedro, or Pedro is more, willing to take an anti-corruption agenda than Tommy. The reason they're battling this out is because they are, they're having factional infighting, which to me is, me da rabia. Because I know we need stability, and I know we need a smooth transition, and I know we need to get back to business as fast as possible because of those federal funds that are stuck up here. But they could have done better, and they could have gone this about a different way. So going back to the questions, so I think that needed clarification, Pedro, no? So going back to the questions, the judicial. Before coming here, I thought, what policy changes, type of things would you need? The lack of independence of the judicial is imperative. It is a rubber stamping entity. And yes, people don't have faith in it. And the woman who is currently there is, what? the current Secretary of Justice, Wanda Vasquez, is somebody that is so objectionable. So going back to Audie's comments, when you think about constitutional amendments or amending the Constitution, I don't think so much as secession, because I don't think we can't be happening. I mean, this one has happened once in all these years. It can't be like a regular thing. But I think, amendment to constitutions pertaining to the Department of Justice and how that person is elected. And should it be elected by committee? Should it be, how do you guarantee that that person is truly independent and not a rubber stamper of the government? I think that's super important. Going back to, now that I'm in with Addie's, to me, secession, yes, you would have to deal with it, but that's not so much of a, I think more of, the justice, that would be a constitutional issue. I think of laws that need to be passed, that you need somebody willing to pass them. One would have to be with open data for the procurement process, and, having, RFPs, not, the ones that are for qualifications, having the criteria at the opening, deciding by committee. These are things that legally should be done. The open data is huge. And not only do these things, but actually have laws with teeth that will implement these things. We should have open data. This is a law for political contributions. You can get that information, but it's hard. In the United States, you have something called open secrets. You want to know who's getting money, you just open secrets. We should have those. Those are concrete changes to laws that would really improve our capacity to govern, because corruption is grounded completely in the patronage political system, where to win an election, you need contributors, and those contributors will be rewarded either in employment or contracts. And that is the source of all the corruption in Puerto Rico. It's not bribes from the cops. It's not all sorts of other corruptions that happen in other places in Latin America. That is strictly it. So, things to regulate, laws to regulate and enforce, the contracts procedures, laws to open up who's getting money from who, an independent justice to enforce those laws, with the fury of God if you break it, that is very important. And as for the status, I'm only going to comment on the status because I find it interesting. There is, well, I guess if I lived there, I might be more worried, but from here I find it interesting. People are worried that they're going to be dropped out, that the United States and their Trump administration is going to cut them off. And so they are a little bit tentative. I mean, people talk about it, this might be the opportunity. They're looking to cut us off. They talk a lot about Venezuela and they're very fearful of communism, which strikes me as rather odd, because Puerto Ricans like to make money and keep it. They're not about to start, so I don't think it's part of we're a capitalist country, but there is a real fear of being dropped out of the map, by the United States right now, because we have an irascible president and you never know. And at the same token, we could go on status forever. I mean, it's just such a dense, clearly I thought after Hurricane more people would want to become a state. That quite didn't happen. They became very proud of what they could do and accomplish themselves. I grew up in the generation where independence was not an option. Where there were blacklists when I was growing up. We were told don't go to X place because there's going to be FBI agents, so I'm from that generation. I think if the nationalist movement had been given a chance, which it never was, maybe it would be a different country today, and maybe we would be contemplating independence as an option. But that opportunity to grow that part of us, that political part of us, was really never given to us. So.
Well, 11 o'clock sharp. This has been, I think, a terrific session, very informative. Thank you, Pedro and Gretchen, for sharing your insights. A lot of uncertainty, but also some hope. And I think that came through very, very clearly. I want to finally thank again Ricardo Barrios with the dialogue for his work, not only with this event, but all of what we do on Puerto Rico. We've had another event. Today we had something in the Latin American yesterday in the Latin American Advisor. There are copies out there for you. So this is something that the dialogue will continue to follow. We think it's very important to get good information and good analysis out there. And thank you all for coming this morning, for being with us. Thank you.